Today we'll be talking about the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period of time that was known as the rebirth of classical knowledge after years of fighting and war and disease. This was a time period of a lot of intellectual advancements. And again, we're talking about so much history happening, and we're just going to talk about a few important highlights. So get a lined piece of paper. Write down generally, make sure you know what the Renaissance was, and that it's generally the time period between 1350, that's when it began in Italy, till the 1700s. So no kind of generally that, and that it started in Italy. The arts and inventions and literature, these were all things that took place during the Renaissance. They followed the Crusades, all the wars. Trade really flourished across all parts of Europe. Merchants were growing wealthy. People were trading. They lived happier lives, generally speaking, during this time. So here's just kind of a map of the trade routes across Europe and parts of Asia during this time period. And you can see right here that Italy is right in the center of the trade routes. Italy really became the banking center, like the capital of money and exchange. Lots of different people came there, people fled there, particularly scholars and academics that weren't appreciated in other parts of the world. People fled there after the fall of different rulers. So it was really just a wealthy and flourishing city at the time that a lot of talent came out of and then spread across the rest of the continent and other parts of the world. Now, a patron in the Middle Ages were just wealthy people or families that sponsored the arts being anything from painting to plays and the beginnings of early theater. Patrons were considered to have high social status, and one family that was influential in the beginning of the Renaissance, spreading throughout Italy, was the Medici family. So know that the Medici family was very influential in starting the Renaissance. Know that the Renaissance started in Italy and that it was really a revival of the arts and higher thinking and intellectual practices after a very hard time. There were lots of new ideas. So, thus far, a lot of governments focused their laws on religion. And now the focus was more of a worldly theme rather than just a religious theme. Humanism, the emphasis on an individual rather than the part of a larger group. So for the first time, we're seeing it being acceptable for people to be different, be individuals, not kind of all have to follow the same sort of rules. This was the beginning of that sort of cultural acceptance that we still have in modern day times. The impact of money on new ideas, they had major advancements in the arts, from sculpting and painting to theater, literature, and philosophy, and all sorts of scholarly things, and education. Okay, artists. We're going to go through a few artists that were famous in the Middle Ages. Write down their name and maybe one fact about them. So the first one we're going to talk about is Leonardo da Vinci. Most of you have probably heard of him. He lived from 1452 to 1519. He's known as the ultimate Renaissance man. He was a painter, a scientist, a sculptor, and inventor. Some of his famous works include the Mona Lisa that you've seen before, and The Last Supper. This is another painting, a religious one, that you may have seen before and just didn't realize that it was a work of Da Vinci. I want you to pay attention to the perspective of the art in this picture. So they really used lines. It almost looks kind of three-dimensional using that perspective. Kind of just cool. All right, another famous artist was Michelangelo. He lived from 1475 to 1564. He's often considered the greatest artist of all time. He was a painter, a sculptor, and an architect. Some of his most famous works include the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, beautiful painting covering a very, very large area, the David statue, and the Pieta, a religious sculpture. Another artist was Botticelli. He lived from 1445 to 1510. He's best known for portraits of people. Here's an example of his portraits. And he also painted mythological creatures. Another artist is Raphael. Raphael lived from 1483 to 1520, and he studied in Florence, but mostly worked in Rome. And his most famous work is the School of Athens. And this is really interesting because, as you can see, he actually painted some of the other famous artists into his own picture. So, very, very, very cool. All right, now we're going to talk about some of the famous writers from the Renaissance. So same thing, write down their name, one fact about them. You'll be taking a picture, uploading this document to get your points for the assignment. The first one we're going to cover is Dante. Dante lived from 1265 to 1321. He was the author of a very famous work called The Divine Comedy. It was a very imaginative work about the afterlife. He was actually the first to use an interlocking 3-line rhyme. So he invented his own rhyme and own sort of poetry and stanza for his plays and writing. Another famous writer was Petrarch. He lived in the beginning of the Renaissance again, from 1304 to 1374. He was a famous scholar and a poet. He's also known as the father of humanism, so that idea of individuality. He traveled all over Europe and he collected classical writings. Another famous artist was Erasmus. Erasmus lived from 1466 to 1536. He was a Dutch philosopher and a Christian humanist. He was known as the greatest scholar of the Northern Renaissance, and he was influential in the Protestant Reformation. So he definitely was an influential writer. Niccolo Machiavelli. That one is definitely hard to pronounce. 1469 to 1527. He actually wrote The Prince, and this was a handbook created for politics and ruling. He supported absolute power in the government, and he was not as well liked by some because of his ideas. Our next famous writer is William Shakespeare. You've probably heard of Shakespeare before. Make sure you write down and know who he is. He lived more towards the end of the Renaissance, from 1564 to 1616. He was from England, and he was a playwright. So he wrote many famous plays that are still performed today. Some that you may have heard of: Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and Hamlet. The impact of the Renaissance. It spread all the way from Italy to Northern Europe. It really sparked an interest in the arts and technology and exploration and trade. It paved the way for reform. So in some parts of Europe where life was still not great for people and there was government control or different persecution based on religion or social class, it really paved the way for some changes. And it marks the birth of the modern world. So the time period after the Renaissance is really considered our modern world and modern day. Now, here's what I want you to think about, and a question I want you to answer in your notes. If you were a wealthy noble back in the Renaissance, and we're going to say you don't have to live in Florence, you can live anywhere, what one work of art, I know it says works, would you go see? Would you go see a play by William Shakespeare and pay to see that? Would you go and admire the statues built by Michelangelo? What would you spend your money on? All right, students, please upload a copy of your notes or a picture of your notes, and then keep them for the open note test on the Middle Ages and the Renaissance this week. There will be a few questions about the Renaissance on there. They will all be things covered in this PowerPoint. All right, have a good rest of your day.